In 1865, the Central Pacific Railroad ran out of workers. White laborers refused. The work was too dangerous, too brutal, and the pay too low for what was being asked. Men looked at those granite mountains rising out of California, and they walked away. So the railroad hired 2,000 Chinese immigrants. Most had never seen a mountain like the Sierra Nevada. Many had never held a drill or swung a sledgehammer in their lives. They came from the Pearl River Delta in Guangdong Province, from rice paddies and fishing villages, from a world that looked nothing like the frozen peaks waiting for them. They lowered themselves on ropes over sheer granite cliffs and drilled blasting holes by hand, dangling over drops of 1,000 feet with nothing but woven reed baskets between them and the rocks below. They survived avalanches that buried entire work camps. They built snow tunnels just to reach the rock face in winter. They worked through storms that killed their colleagues by the dozen, and they kept working. They built the hardest section of the Transcontinental Railroad, and when the last spike was driven at Promontory Summit on May 10, 1869, they were not invited to the ceremony. The famous photographs show white men in top hats shaking hands. The Chinese workers who made it possible are nowhere to be seen. This is the story of what they actually did and what it cost them. To understand why the Central Pacific turned to Chinese workers, you have to understand the position the railroad found itself in by early 1865. The company had been chartered back in 1861, tasked with building eastward from Sacramento, California, to meet the Union Pacific coming west from Omaha. The Pacific Railroad Acts had promised generous terms: land grants along the right-of-way, government bonds for every mile of track completed. The more difficult the terrain, the more money per mile. Flat prairie paid less than mountain crossings, which meant the Sierra Nevada was where the real money was. The government was paying by the mile, and every mile of track laid meant money in the pockets of the Big Four, the quartet of Sacramento merchants who controlled the Central Pacific. Leland Stanford was the politician, serving as governor of California, while simultaneously enriching himself through railroad contracts. Collis Huntington handled the lobbying in Washington, making sure the government subsidies kept flowing. Mark Hopkins managed the finances, and Charles Crocker ran construction. These were not railroad men by training. They were shopkeepers who had made their fortunes selling supplies to gold rush miners, men who saw opportunity in government contracts and Western expansion. They needed to build this railroad as quickly as possible because every delay cost them money and gave the Union Pacific more time to lay track from the east, claiming more of the subsidies for themselves. The problem was the Sierra Nevada. The Union Pacific had it relatively easy out on the Great Plains. Flat land, minimal grading, predictable weather, just lay track and keep moving. The Central Pacific had to punch through one of the most formidable mountain ranges on the continent. Granite peaks, steep canyons, passes at 7,000 feet where winter lasted 8 months. And the work required bodies, thousands of them. Charles Crocker was the construction boss, the one who had to actually get the railroad built while his partners handled politics and money. By early 1865, he was desperate. The Central Pacific had started construction in January 1863, and after 2 years of work, they had managed to lay just 50 miles of track. The line barely reached beyond the Sacramento Valley, and ahead loomed the real challenge: the mountains. White workers kept quitting. The pay was around $35 a month plus room and board, which sounds reasonable until you understand what the work actually involved. 12-hour days minimum, often 14 or 16. Swinging picks into rock that refused to break. Hauling dirt and rubble in wheelbarrows up steep grades. On sleeping in canvas tents in freezing mountain camps where the wind cut through everything. Eating whatever the company cookhouses served, which was usually monotonous and often rancid, and always the knowledge that the job got harder the higher you climbed. Men would work for a few weeks, collect their pay, and head for the silver mines in Nevada, where the money was better and the work, while still brutal, at least happened underground, where you weren't freezing to death in the open air. The Comstock lode was pulling workers away from every other job in the region. Crocker was hemorrhaging laborers faster than he could recruit them. For every 10 men he hired, 6 or 7 would quit within a month. His superintendent, James Harvey Strobridge, had a suggestion that he himself initially resisted: hire Chinese laborers. And there were thousands of them in California by 1865, most having come during the gold rush years. Some had work claims themselves, others had opened laundries, restaurants, and shops to serve the mining camps. They had built a community in San Francisco, in Sacramento, in the smaller towns scattered through the foothills. They were available, they would work. Strobridge didn't like the idea. He thought Chinese workers were too small, too weak for railroad construction. Most stood around 5 feet tall and weighed maybe 120 pounds. Strobridge looked at them and saw men who would collapse under the weight of the work. He saw men who looked nothing like his Irish and German laborers, men who spoke no English, men who kept to themselves and practiced customs he didn't understand. There was also the simple racism of the time. When California in the 1860s was not a welcoming place for Chinese immigrants, anti-Chinese sentiment ran deep. State laws discriminated against them. They were barred from testifying against white people in court. They were taxed at rates that didn't apply to white miners. They were pushed out of the goldfields by violence and legal harassment. The idea of hiring thousands of them for the most important construction project in the state struck Strobridge as risky at best. Crocker overruled him. They were out of options. Every white worker who quit meant delays, and delays cost money. If Chinese workers could do the job, Crocker didn't care what Strobridge thought about it. In February 1865, the Central Pacific hired its first crew of 50 Chinese workers as an experiment. They put them to work grading roadbed near Auburn, California, doing the same backbreaking labor that white workers kept abandoning. Within weeks, Strobridge changed his mind entirely. The Chinese workers showed up on time, every single day. They worked without complaint, without stopping, without the constant grumbling and threats that characterized the white crews. They organized themselves into crews with their own headmen, their own cooks, their own supervisors. Each crew of about 30 men worked as a unit, responsible for its own meals, its own sleeping arrangements, its own internal discipline. They didn't drink whiskey, which was a constant problem with white laborers who would disappear on payday and return days later, hungover and useless. The Chinese workers drank tea, which they boiled, which meant they weren't getting dysentery from contaminated water the way so many white workers did. They bathed regularly when water was available, washing the dust and sweat from their bodies, which reduced skin infections and other illnesses that plagued the camps. They brought their own food, rice and dried fish and vegetables and dried fruits that they prepared themselves, which kept them healthier than the men eating the company-provided salt pork and beans. And they worked. My God, did they work. Crocker expanded the hiring immediately. He sent agents to San Francisco to recruit from the Chinese community there. He sent word back to China through labor contractors, men who made their living recruiting workers for American employers. The message spread through the Pearl River Delta. The Gold Mountain Railroad was hiring. The pay was fair. The work was hard but honest. Come to California and make your fortune. They came by the thousands. Some had been farmers in Guangdong province, working rice paddies and vegetable plots. Some had been fishermen. Some had been merchants or craftsmen. They ranged in age from teenagers to men in their 40s and 50s. They came because there was nothing for them at home, because civil war and famine had devastated southern China, because the money they could earn on the railroad would feed their families and maybe someday bring them enough to return home as wealthy men. By the end of 1865, the Central Pacific had several thousand Chinese workers on the payroll. By 1867, the number exceeded 10,000. By 1868, at the peak of construction, somewhere between 12 and 15,000 Chinese men were building this railroad. They made up roughly 90% of the Central Pacific's workforce. And without them, the railroad would not have been built, period. The pay was not equal. White workers got $35 a month plus board, meaning the company provided their meals and housing. Chinese workers got between $27 and $35 a month and had to provide their own food and supplies. They purchased rice and other goods from company stores or from Chinese merchants who set up shop near the work camps, often at inflated prices. The railroad deducted the cost of the labor contractors who had recruited them, taking a cut of their wages before they ever saw a dime. After all the deductions, many Chinese workers were sending whatever they could spare back to families in Guangdong province, using a network of Chinese businesses and money changers to transfer funds across the Pacific. Families who were depending on this money to survive, to pay off debts, to buy food during lean years. Every dollar these men earned on the railroad was a dollar that might keep their parents or wives or children alive on the other side of the world. If you're still with me, hit that subscribe button. This channel covers the forgotten workers who built the world we live in, and I've got more stories like this one coming. If you want to understand what these men faced, you have to understand Cape Horn. This was a sheer granite promontory jutting out over the American River Canyon, roughly 2,000 feet above the water below. The canyon wall rose almost vertically from the river, a face of gray stone that offered no purchase, no ledge, nothing to build upon, and the railroad needed to carve a ledge into this face. A shelf wide enough to hold tracks, blasted and chipped out of solid granite. There was no way to approach from above because the slope was nearly vertical. There was no way to build scaffolding because there was nothing to anchor it to, no purchase in the smooth stone. Traditional construction methods were useless here. The engineers looked at Cape Horn and saw an impossible problem. The Chinese workers figured out a solution. They wove baskets from reeds, baskets large enough to hold a man crouching with his tools. They rigged ropes from the cliff top, anchored to whatever they could find, trees or boulders or driven stakes. A worker would climb into the basket, carrying a hand drill and a hammer and a small supply of black powder. His colleagues above would lower him down the rock face to wherever the drilling needed to happen. I'm playing out rope hand over hand while the basket swung in the wind. Picture this. You're hanging in a woven basket over a 2,000-foot drop. Below you is nothing but air and the American River. So far down, it looks like a ribbon of silver. The basket creaks and sways. The rope above you is the only thing keeping you alive. A hemp line an inch thick, held by your fellow workers, men you have to trust absolutely, because if they slip, if they lose their grip, if the rope frays and snaps, you fall. You have a hand drill, a steel rod with a hardened tip. You have a hammer, 4 or 5 pounds of iron. You position the drill against the granite, pressing it into a crevice or a slight depression in the rock, and you start swinging. Each blow drives the drill maybe a 1/16 of an inch into the stone. The vibration travels up your arms, through your shoulders, into your spine. You swing again and again and again for hours. When you have a hole deep enough to hold a charge of black powder, maybe 8 or 10 inches deep, you pack the powder in. You insert a fuse, you light it, and your colleagues above haul you up as fast as they can, hand over hand, racing the burning fuse, racing the seconds before the charge explodes and sends chunks of granite flying through the air where you just were. Sometimes they didn't haul fast enough. Sometimes the fuse burned faster than expected, sparking through a weak section of cord that should have been slower. Sometimes the rope frayed against the granite edge and snapped, sending man and basket tumbling into the void. Sometimes the explosion itself caught workers above. Men who hadn't gotten far enough back from the cliff edge when the blast went off. Men fell. Men were blown apart by explosions they couldn't escape. Men died screaming on the way down, or died silently when the blast took them before they could make a sound. The company kept no records of Chinese deaths, so we don't know exactly how many men died at Cape Horn. The payroll records show men appearing and disappearing, hired 1 month and gone the next, but there's no indication whether they quit, were fired, or died on the job. We just know that the work continued, that the basket crews kept going down, that the ledge slowly took shape inch by inch, blast by blast. The men who died at Cape Horn weren't buried properly. There was no Chinese cemetery in the mountains, no Buddhist temple to perform the proper rites. They were buried where they fell, in shallow graves scraped into whatever soil could be found, graves that would be covered by rockfall or washed away by spring floods. Some families in China would wait years for word of sons and husbands who never came home, never knowing exactly what had happened, never able to mourn properly because there was no body to mourn, and Cape Horn was just the beginning. The thing you have to understand is that Cape Horn, as brutal and dangerous as it was, wasn't even the hardest part of the job. That came later, higher up in the mountains, at a place called Summit Tunnel. The Central Pacific needed to cross the Sierra Nevada at Donner Pass, 7,000 feet above sea level. This was the same route that had killed the Donner Party 20 years earlier, the pass where 42 people died in the winter of 1846 to 47, resorting to cannibalism before the spring thaw finally allowed rescue parties to reach them. The Central Pacific was going to punch a railroad through this place, through the same frozen hell that had claimed so many lives. Directly in the path of the railroad was a ridge of solid granite. There was no way around it, no convenient valley or lower pass. The only way forward was through. Summit Tunnel would be 1,659 feet long, carved entirely through granite so hard that it destroyed drill bits on contact and laughed at black powder charges that would have shattered softer stone. Work on Summit Tunnel began in the fall of 1866. The plan was to attack the mountain from multiple directions simultaneously. Work crews would start at both the east and west portals of the tunnel, by drilling and blasting inward toward a meeting point in the middle. And to speed things up, the engineers decided to sink a vertical shaft from the top of the ridge down to the tunnel level, 73 feet straight down through solid rock. Once they reached the tunnel depth, crews could work outward in both directions from the center, giving them 4 working faces instead of 2. This sounds simple on paper. In practice, it was a nightmare that pushed the workers beyond anything they had faced before. The rock was Sierra granite, some of the hardest stone on Earth. Hand drills dulled after a few strikes, the hardened steel tips blunting against the crystalline structure of the rock. A good day's progress might mean 8 inches of advancement on a working face. 8 inches. The tunnel was 1,659 feet long. At 8 inches per day, in working all 4 faces simultaneously, you're looking at more than a year of drilling just to complete the tunnel. And that's assuming perfect conditions, no delays, no complications. In the real world, with winter coming and the mountain fighting back every step of the way, even that optimistic timeline seemed impossible. The workers developed a rhythm. Drill men worked in teams of 3, one holding the drill steady against the rock face while the other 2 swung sledgehammers in alternating blows. Left, right, 8, 10, 12 hours at a time, the ring of steel on steel echoing off the tunnel walls, bouncing back from the darkness ahead. The air filled with granite dust, a fine gray powder that coated everything, that got into your lungs and stayed there, that turned your spit gray and made your eyes burn. When they had enough holes drilled, they packed them with powder, lit the fuses, and everyone ran for the tunnel entrance. You learned quickly how many seconds you had. You learned to count as you ran, to judge the distance, to throw yourself flat against the tunnel wall or around a bend just before the explosion hit. The blast would roar through the confined space, the pressure wave slamming against your eardrums, chunks of rock flying past like artillery shells. After the explosion, they waited for the dust and smoke to clear, which could take 30 minutes or more in the poorly ventilated tunnel. Then they went back into the choking darkness, to haul out the rubble and start drilling again. Bucket brigades carried the broken rock to the tunnel mouth, an endless line of men passing debris hand to hand. The debris piles grew outside the entrances, small mountains of shattered granite that marked the progress of the tunnel. In October 1866, the railroad brought in nitroglycerin. Nitroglycerin is not dynamite. Dynamite, which Alfred Nobel would patent the following year in 1867, is nitroglycerin stabilized with diatomaceous earth, making it relatively safe to handle. Pure nitroglycerin is one of the most dangerous explosives ever created. It's sensitive to heat, to shock, to friction. A jar dropped on the ground can detonate. A jar left in the sun can detonate. A jar subjected to vibration from a passing wagon can detonate. Sometimes it detonates for no apparent reason at all, some minor chemical instability triggering a blast that kills everyone nearby. The railroad started manufacturing it on site because shipping it was too dangerous. A crate of nitroglycerin had exploded in San Francisco earlier that year, leveling a Wells Fargo building and killing 15 people in the blast. The streets around the explosion had been turned to rubble, windows shattered for blocks in every direction. No one was going to transport that substance over mountain roads, where a single jolt could mean annihilation. So the Central Pacific set up a manufacturing facility near the worksite and started producing the stuff themselves. Chinese workers, some of them with no background in chemistry whatsoever, learned to mix the volatile compound under the direction of company chemists. They handled containers of liquid explosive that could kill them if they moved too quickly, if they let the temperature rise too high, if they sneezed at the wrong moment. The results were dramatically effective. In nitroglycerin, blasted granite, that black powder could barely chip. A single charge could do the work of 10 black powder blasts, shattering rock that had resisted everything else. Progress accelerated. The tunnel began to grow faster than anyone had hoped, but so did the deaths. The explosive was unpredictable. Workers learned to treat it with religious caution, but caution only goes so far when you're handling liquid death in a cold, cramped tunnel lit by candles. Sometimes a charge misfired, and a worker went back to check on it, only to have it detonate in his face. Sometimes a container cracked from temperature changes and leaked onto a worker's hands, leaving traces that could explode from the friction of touching anything else. Sometimes a whole manufacturing batch went up at once, killing everyone in the vicinity. Men died in these explosions, torn apart by blasts that left nothing recognizable behind. How many? Again, the company didn't record Chinese deaths systematically, so we're left with estimates and fragments. One contractor later claimed that the Central Pacific's Chinese workforce suffered around 1,000 deaths over the course of construction. Other estimates from contemporary observers go higher, some suggesting that 1,500 or more men died building the railroad. The Granite Mountains absorbed these men and gave back nothing, not even an accurate count of the dead. And then came the winter of 1866 to 1867. If you've been watching this far, subscribe now, because what comes next is almost beyond comprehension. The Sierra Nevada in winter is no place for human beings. The workers building Summit Tunnel learned this in the most brutal way imaginable. 44 feet of snow fell that winter. Not 44 inches, 44 feet. Entire work camps disappeared under the white, buildings vanished. Roads became impassable. The supply lines that connected the work camps to Sacramento and the outside world were cut for weeks at a time. Avalanches swept down without warning. The mountains would shift and groan, and then a wall of snow would come roaring down the slopes, burying everything in its path. Men, equipment, whole sections of the line. The snow moved faster than a man could run, a churning white wave that picked up rocks and trees and added them to its mass. If you were in the path of an avalanche, you were dead. There was no outrunning it, no hiding from it, and no shelter that could withstand its force. The Chinese workers built snow tunnels to reach the rock face. They carved out passages under the snowpack, creating a labyrinth of frozen corridors that connected their camps to the working tunnel entrances. These tunnels were engineering marvels in their own right, carefully shored up with timber to prevent collapse, lit by candles that flickered in the cold air. The workers lived in these snow tunnels for months, seeing daylight only rarely. They slept underground, ate underground, worked underground. The only time they emerged was to haul out debris or bring in supplies. When storms hit, they stayed below and waited. The wind howled above them, the snow piled deeper and deeper. They sat in their carved-out caverns, burning what fuel they had, eating rice and dried fish, and waiting for the weather to break. Some of them must have wondered if the spring would ever come, if they would ever see sunlight again. When the weather cleared enough to move, they went back to work. Always back to work. The tunnel wasn't going to build itself, and every day of delay was a day the Union Pacific gained on them from the east. The cold was relentless. Even in the snow tunnels, temperatures dropped below freezing. The workers had brought quilted cotton clothes from China, adequate for California winters at lower elevations, but barely sufficient for the Sierra summit. Frostbite took fingers and toes. Men worked with hands that had lost all feeling, swinging hammers they could barely grip. The company eventually provided heavier clothing, but it came late and never in sufficient quantity. The avalanches killed without discrimination. One slide buried a camp of about 20 workers and wasn't discovered until spring, when the snow melted enough to reveal the bodies. Some were found still clutching their tools, frozen in the moment of working or walking. Others had clearly died trying to dig their way out, their hands clawed toward the surface. They had suffocated in the darkness, packed in by snow so dense it might as well have been concrete. James Strobridge, the superintendent who had initially doubted these workers, later wrote about that winter with something approaching awe. He described men who refused to quit, who went back into the tunnels day after day despite conditions that would have broken anyone. The work didn't stop. The tunnel kept growing. Inch by inch, blast by blast, the Chinese workers punched through the mountain. The vertical shaft that was supposed to speed construction became a death trap. Water seeped through the rock and froze, coating the shaft walls with ice. Workers lowering themselves down to the tunnel level had to navigate a frozen chimney that could send them plummeting if they lost their grip. Hauling debris up the shaft meant fighting gravity, ice, and exhaustion all at once. They kept working. Summit Tunnel was finally completed in November 1867. 1,659 feet through solid granite, achieved almost entirely by hand, in conditions that killed dozens, if not hundreds, of the men who built it. When the last wall of rock fell and the crews from either end could see each other's lanterns through the dust, and the measurements showed that the two bores were off by less than 2 inches in alignment. 2 inches after drilling from opposite ends through 1,700 feet of granite, using 19th century surveying equipment and illuminated by candlelight in a granite tomb. The precision of this achievement remains one of the great engineering accomplishments in American history. Textbooks mention it in discussions of surveying and tunnel construction. Engineers study it as an example of what's possible with careful measurement and disciplined execution. The workers who made it possible were paid $27 to $35 a month, received no credit in the official company records, and were excluded from any celebration when the tunnel was completed. The final push came in 1868 and 1869. With Summit Tunnel complete and the Sierra crossing behind them, the Central Pacific raced east across Nevada and into Utah to meet the Union Pacific coming west. This was flat country now, or at least flatter than the Sierra, high desert and salt flats and alkaline plains that stretched to the horizon. The work was different here, faster and less deadly, though still brutal in its own way. Summer heat instead of winter cold. Dust storms instead of avalanches. The Chinese workers who had survived the mountains proved just as capable on the plains. Track-laying crews set records that seemed impossible. The iron rails arrived by train as far as the track extended, then had to be carried forward by hand, positioned, spiked, and moved past as the next rails arrived. The rhythm of track laying became almost mechanical, a choreography of teams that had learned to work together through years of shared hardship. 10 miles of track in a single day became possible. On April 28, 1869, a Central Pacific crew laid 10 miles and 56 feet of track in a single day, a record that would stand for decades. 8 Chinese rail handlers lifted and positioned over 3,000 tons of iron that day, moving with a precision born of necessity and survival. These were men who had learned to trust each other in the tunnels and on the cliffs. They had seen their friends die beside them and kept working. They had buried their colleagues in unmarked graves and returned to the job the next day. They took that discipline, that coordination, that sheer stubborn persistence, and they applied it to flat ground track laying. And they set records that amazed everyone who watched. May 10th, 1869, Promontory Summit, Utah Territory, the Golden Spike Ceremony. Leland Stanford, the railroad president and former California governor, swung a silver-plated sledgehammer at the ceremonial final spike and missed. He swung again and missed again. The crowd laughed nervously. Eventually, someone else drove the spike home. The telegraph wires connected to the rails sent a signal across the nation, a single word repeated over and over, done, done, done. The Transcontinental Railroad was complete. East and West were joined. A journey that had taken months by wagon or years by ship around Cape Horn could now be completed in days by rail. The nation celebrated. Cannons fired in cities across the country. Bells rang. People poured into the streets to celebrate the achievement of the age. The photographs from that day show crowds of white men in formal dress, railroad officials in top hats, dignitaries in suits, engineers and journalists and politicians. Two locomotives face each other on the completed track, their cowcatchers nearly touching. Men pose with champagne bottles, their faces bright with triumph. It's a celebration of American achievement, of manifest destiny realized, of the continent conquered by iron and steam. The Chinese workers who made this moment possible are not in the photographs. They weren't invited to the ceremony. After years of labor, after the cliffs and the tunnels and the avalanches and the nitroglycerin, after burying their colleagues in shallow graves on the mountainsides, so the workers who built the hardest sections of this railroad were excluded from the moment of triumph. They stood somewhere off camera, or perhaps they had already begun the journey back west, looking for new work on other construction projects. Their absence from the photographs is absolute. You can look through every image from Promontory Summit and you will not find a single Chinese face. Some were already heading back to California, looking for whatever jobs they could find. Some returned to San Francisco to rejoin the Chinese community there, to open businesses or find work on other railroads. Some went back to China with whatever money they had managed to save, returning to families who had waited years for their return, and some stayed in the mountains, finding work as cooks or laundrymen in the mining towns that dotted the Sierra foothills, settling into a country that would soon make it illegal for any more of their countrymen to follow them. Subscribe if you want to know what happened next. Because what this country did to these workers after they finished building the railroad is almost as shameful as how they were treated during construction. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was the first law in American history to bar a specific ethnic group from immigrating to the United States. It came just 13 years after the Golden Spike, just 13 years after Chinese workers had proven themselves indispensable to one of the greatest engineering projects the nation had ever undertaken. The law banned Chinese laborers from entering the country and prohibited Chinese residents from becoming naturalized citizens. It was passed with overwhelming bipartisan support, signed by President Chester Arthur, and celebrated by labor unions and politicians alike. The same politicians who had praised Chinese industriousness when they needed railroad workers now described them as a threat to American labor. The same newspapers that had marveled at the Summit Tunnel achievement now ran editorials about the Chinese menace, about the danger of Asian hordes flooding American shores, about the need to protect white workers from competition. The workers who had risked their lives on the cliffs of Cape Horn were reimagined as dangerous outsiders who needed to be kept out. The Exclusion Act would remain in effect until 1943. Shao's wartime alliance with China against Japan made the law politically inconvenient. By then, 60 years had passed. Several generations of Chinese Americans had lived under its shadow. Families had been separated indefinitely. Communities had been isolated and marginalized. The workers who built the railroad were aging and dying. Their stories largely untold, their contributions minimized or erased from the historical record. The Central Pacific's records are maddeningly incomplete when it comes to Chinese workers. The company recorded white worker deaths with names and circumstances. A foreman killed in a blasting accident would be noted by name, his death reported to his family, his burial arranged and documented. Chinese workers were counted as a group if they were counted at all. Payroll records exist, but individual names are rare. When a white foreman died, there was a funeral and a notation. When Chinese workers died in an avalanche, they were noted as a number on a report, if they were noted at all. This isn't accidental. This is what erasure looks like in historical records. The same company that depended on these workers for 90% of its labor force couldn't be bothered to record their names when they died building its railroad. The same company that set records with Chinese track-laying crews kept those workers out of the photographs that documented its triumph. Modern scholars have tried to reconstruct what happened. Oral histories collected from Chinese American families in the early 20th century provide some details, fragments of stories passed down through generations. Archaeological excavations at old work camps have uncovered artifacts, rice bowls and teacups and opium pipes and gaming pieces, the material remnants of lives lived in the shadow of the mountains. Genealogical research has traced some workers back to their home villages in Guangdong province. matching names on old contracts to families who still remember ancestors who went to Gold Mountain and never returned. But the full story remains incomplete. We know approximately how many Chinese workers built this railroad. We know approximately how many died. We know, in general terms, what they accomplished. What we don't have is what we have for so many white participants in this history: names and faces and individual stories. The Chinese workers remain a mass, a collective, a number rather than a roster of individuals. In 2014, the United States Department of Labor inducted Chinese railroad workers into its Labor Hall of Honor. In 2019, on the 150th anniversary of the Golden Spike ceremony, a group of Chinese Americans gathered at Promontory Summit for a commemorative event. They brought photographs of ancestors who had worked on the railroad, faded images carefully preserved through generations. They read names, as many as they could document, speaking them aloud in the Utah wind. They acknowledged what had been deliberately forgotten. The Granite Mountains are still there. The tunnels are still there. Summit Tunnel remains in use, now part of an active Union Pacific freight line. Trains pass through it every day. Diesel locomotives hauling freight cars through rock that was carved by hand drills and nitroglycerin, by men whose names we have largely lost. I want you to think about what it meant to lower yourself over a 2,000-foot cliff in a woven basket. I want you to imagine the sound of the hammer striking the drill, the echo of it bouncing off the granite walls, the knowledge that one slip, one bad moment, one frayed rope could send you into the void. I want you to imagine working in a tunnel filled with granite dust, where the air was so thick you could barely breathe, where the candles flickered in the bad air and the sound of drilling never stopped. I want you to imagine surviving all of that, emerging in the spring of 1869 to race across the desert and set world records for track laying, and then watching from somewhere off camera as white men in top hats took credit for everything you built. These were men who came from across an ocean looking for opportunity. They found something harder than opportunity. They found work that killed their colleagues and broke their bodies. They found a country that used their labor and then passed laws to keep out anyone who looked like them. They found a railroad company that couldn't bother to record their names when they died, and they built it anyway. The next time you see a map of the American railroad system, look at the line running through the Sierra Nevada. Look at the route through Donner Pass. Someone built that. Not some abstract force of progress or national destiny. Specific men with specific hands, swinging specific hammers. They climbed into baskets and were lowered over cliffs. They breathed granite dust in tunnels lit by candles. They buried their friends in mountain graves that were never properly marked. It's about 12 to 15,000 Chinese workers built the Central Pacific Railroad. Roughly 1,000 of them, maybe more, died doing it. The company that employed them didn't bother recording their names. But the railroad is still there. The tunnels are still there. The ledge at Cape Horn is still there. And now you know who built them. There's a phrase that gets used in discussions of American infrastructure about how we're standing on the shoulders of giants, but giants is the wrong word. These weren't mythological figures. They were men. Ordinary men who did extraordinary work under conditions designed to break them. They weren't giants. They were human beings, 5 feet tall and 120 pounds, lowering themselves into granite canyons with hand drills and explosives. The shoulders we're standing on belonged to people whose names were never recorded, people who died in avalanches that no one documented, people who fell from cliffs and were buried in shallow graves and were forgotten before the last spike was even driven. The cost of progress is measured in bodies. We just don't count them all. The Central Pacific Railroad was completed on May 10, 1869. The Chinese workers who built it went on to build other railroads, other infrastructure, other pieces of the American landscape. The Southern Pacific, the Northern Pacific, lines throughout California and Nevada and Oregon. Wherever the railroads expanded, Chinese workers followed, bringing the skills they had learned in the Sierra to new mountains, new tunnels, new impossible challenges. Some of their descendants are still here. 6th and 7th generation Americans whose ancestors came to Gold Mountain before the Exclusion Act slammed the door shut. Some went home to China, returning to families who had waited years for their return, bringing what money they could save. Some died in the mountains and were never found, Their remains still somewhere under the snow and rock, part of the mountain itself now. The last known survivor of the Chinese railroad workers died in the 1930s. He had spent his final years as a shepherd in Montana, a quiet life after a young manhood spent hanging from ropes over 1,000-foot drops, breathing nitroglycerin fumes in candlelit tunnels. We don't know his Chinese name. Records list him only by the American name he used, a name that may or may not have been his real one. I'm assigned to him by some clerk who couldn't pronounce what he was actually called. The snow still falls in the Sierra Nevada, 44 feet in a bad winter, just like it did in 1866. The granite is still there, still hard, still resistant to everything but the patient work of drill and powder. The tunnels they carved are still there, dark passages through the mountain where the sound of trains has replaced the sound of hammers. The workers are gone. Their camps are archaeological sites now, studied by historians trying to piece together the lives that were lived there. Their graves, where we can find them, are marked with simple stones or not marked at all. What remains is the work, the tunnels, the grades, the engineering achievements that made a continent crossable in days instead of months. What remains is the railroad. And now, what remains is this: a record that they existed, that they mattered, that they built something that outlasted them, that they were here and they worked and they died and they deserve to be remembered. 1,659 feet of granite carved by hand, 1,000 men or more dead and unrecorded, a ceremony they weren't invited to, a history that tried to forget them. Now you know, and now you won't forget either.